I asked her last week when she was here if the show information that she had, which she had a show, an exhibition of her paintings and watercolors in the upstairs gallery here last year, and I asked her if the information had a lot of her background. She said, yeah, there's plenty in there. Well, I looked at it, there's nothing in here, so I'm going to kind of wing it. Doris is a former arts educator in Wheatfield. She has her own studio, Northlight Studio in Wheatfield. She is an accomplished and well-respected watercolorist, as well as being a clay artist, as you have no doubt can see immediately. And she's exhibited in a great many galleries around, and I can't even begin to name as many of them. The last one, though, was an exhibition in the Chesterton Gallery with her two daughters. It was kind of the Myers-Zimmer artist group. So I think you're going to enjoy this a great deal tonight, and I know I am, and you'll all probably learn less than I will. I know that I'll learn a lot. So with all of that, Doris, it's all yours.
Well, I can't tell you how excited I am about being here with the Ashley Artist Teaching Fellowship Program. I participated last year as a person who started a small business as an adult. I guess maybe I could describe it that way. But anyway, that was a lot of fun too. There were 4 or 5 of us women who talked about getting established in a business, and it was very, very much fun. But anyway, tonight I thought in order to explain what I have here, I might have to tell you a little bit of background. And I am assuming that you all want to know how I got started in clay anyway. If I say, are there any questions, that's usually the first one. How did you get started in clay? Well, I got started in clay very late in life. In fact, I got my education, my college education very late in life. I was 35 and had 4 children when I first went to college. And after finishing my work at Raku University, I decided I'd like to do my master's at Ball State, which I had a class many years before that with Dr. Nichols, and I hoped that she would make it possible for me to get a license to teach art since Valpo wasn't accredited. So I called her, and she remembered me, and she had me bring my transcript down, and she transferred 23 of my 26 hours of art to Ball State and put me on a graduate program immediately. And so by fall, I had a license to teach art. But anyway, I didn't have an art job. I went ahead teaching English and biology and a few other things that I suppose people think are important, maybe more important than art, but I haven't decided that yet. Anyway, the first class that she enrolled me in was a pottery class with Marvin Reichel. Anyone know Marvin Reichel from Ball State? Marvin was a product of the 60s. And he said, if you keep making that mistake long enough, you're going to figure out what you're doing wrong and you'll correct it. He didn't say this is what you should be doing. And so if you're taking a 5-week course in clay, and it has to be made, and it has to dry, and it has to be fired, and it has to be glazed, it has to be fired, you don't have a lot of time to figure out what you're doing wrong. So needless to say, at the end of 5 weeks, I didn't have many pieces of pottery, but I sure had a lot of enthusiasm, and it's never waned. I love pottery. And I guess probably I could say if I want to relax, then I work in clay. If I want to think, then I paint. Painting is definitely a thinking experience. Now, I only have one piece that I can show you that I made my first year. This is it. That was made down at Ball State, my very first piece. And it's not anything to really brag about, but it's something that I won't part with because I need that for a record to prove that I had to begin somewhere. And these young people who ask me, oh, but this is so hard, well, I say you have to start somewhere. It's just like life. It's not going to happen easily. You just have to work at it. And definitely that's the truth when it comes to the potter's wheel. If any of you have ever tried it, it's like it's an invention of the devil at first. Getting that clay centered is really an experience. And I didn't center very well that first summer. But later, years later, my husband was working nights at Youngstown Sheet and Tube, and my kids were gone away to college, and I had a lot of evenings free after teaching a full day at KV. So I took a quick 10-minute nap and headed to Valpo University 2 nights a week, and I went through 7 more pottery instructors. Every time they get a new one, I'd go back and take another class because I was sure that person would be able to give me something that I hadn't received before, and that is true. If I can combine all of the wonderful things that each of them taught me, it should make me a good potter, better than what I really am. But I suggest, of course, this crowd is probably all over 18, but I would say that if you can start on the potter's wheel even earlier than 18, you will learn much quicker than I did at 42. It's very difficult. It's like learning a foreign language. You need to start early. Well, what I'm going to do tonight, I'm going to cover quite a bit of territory. I'm going to talk to you about the handouts that I have to give you. We're going through the different types of clay, the various stages of clay being produced from beginning to through the glazing part. We're going to talk about the tools that you need if you're working in clay, methods of decorating pottery. We're going to talk about the methods of applying glazes and how to build pottery, and I'm going to show you some of the things that were done in specific ways, and how to throw a piece of pottery, and at the very end, I'm going to actually demonstrate the potter's wheel for you. I have some slides in the meantime to show you. Two series of them are about a pit firing, or two pit firings that we did. This is called primitive firing, where you dig a hole in the ground and you put your pottery in there and you pile sticks or straw on it, and you actually fire in the hole, like they do over in the Orient and the way the Indians did. And the first time we did this, we didn't have a great deal of success. And I'll explain that as I go along, too. But I think that would be interesting for you. Then, as Bob talked about last week about Raku being a piece of art, by the way, how do we decide whether it's a piece of art? We can say clay is art all you want to, and it's only art, I think, if you think it is. You know, it can be functional, or it can be beautiful, and maybe function is beautiful to some people. But I guess I kind of think of it as going a step beyond just making something. Go just a little bit farther than just really making it. Whether it's enhanced by glazes or incising or whatever it takes to make it a little different, I think that might be what would make it art. Different might be a better word than beautiful, because I'm going to show you some slides that a professor friend sent to me. Some of them are not beautiful, but they are considered art. They're just really different. In fact, Doug Fay was one of my instructors at Valpo University, one of those night classes, in 1973. And I called him. He lives in Denver, and we've kept in touch all these years. And I called him a couple of weeks ago, and I told him about this plan for tonight. And I said, could you send me some slides? And he says, they'll be really kooky. And I said, no, they don't care. We need to see some kooky stuff, too. So he sent me, I think, maybe 20. So I'll share those with you. And then I have a nice handout here that really tells you a little bit about Raku and about making a Raku kiln, and how to do some building, slab building, and that sort of thing. Bonnie asked me if I was going to build a slab pot, and I said, nah, I'll just give them the handout and tell them this was done with a slab method or something. I really didn't want to drag everything I had in the studio. I was lucky to get all this in here. I did have help with that. Okay, I'm going to start, and I'm not going to have these out for just a little bit, because you might get busy reading and not listen. I know how kids are. Okay, this is a piece of clay that I made yesterday, and I'm going to carve into this later and show you how I make a candle lantern out of it. This is called greenware. Actually, it hasn't been fired, and it's very cool to the touch, and would not be fired until it got completely warm, room temperature. Then it's dry enough to put in the kiln's fire. And later, I'm going to cut into it and make a candle lantern out of it like this. This has fish on it. I will pass this along. Don't get too involved, though. You want to listen. Then this is called bisqueware. This means it's been fired one time, but it hasn't been glazed yet. After it's glazed, then it becomes glaze fired. A plate there, this is just fired. And this is a stoneware body. This means it's a high fire. And when I fire this the first time, it goes to about 1900 degrees, and when I fire it the second time, it goes to 2600 in order to melt the glazes and make them waterproof or whatever. It depends on how we use them. Talking about the clay body, and I already mentioned that that was stoneware, so I'll quickly add the others to your vocabulary. Clay body actually is a mixture of clays. someone said to me, do you mix your own clay? And I said, no, I don't have room in my studio for many dry clays, because most clay bodies, which means like you, it's made up of several things, usually is made up of about 5 kinds of clay. Some might come from Atlanta, Georgia, where that red clay is, or it might come from southern Ohio or Michigan or different places. And we put that together to get it to behave in the way we want it to, in this case, to be high-fired. If it's earthenware or low-fired, then it might be made with a different kind of clay, and it might be red or it might be white. This was a lower-fired clay. Grog is something, Bob, we talked about last time, that makes Raku work. It's actually clay that's been fired, that's ground up. It's ground at different grains. You can get it really fine like sand, or it can be more coarse than that. And they put it with a clay body to make Raku clay able to withstand a terrible thermal shock, which when I explain how that's done, you'll understand what I'm talking about. It has to be porous so they can be taken out of high heat and put in cool temperature. And Raku, actually, the original name of that was used by Japanese as a making of tea bowls, as Bob told you last week. But now the method of firing is called Raku. It's not just tea bowls, but anything that you make. And these are all pieces of Raku. I don't have a lot to show you, I mean a lot of really good pieces, but this is a slab piece that was wrapped around, it was textured and it was wrapped around and put together. And I think we might have mentioned too that it's tricky. I mean, sometimes if you don't know how to build a piece, it's very likely that you could lose it. This one actually was built in 2 canister cans and put together, and I didn't get it fastened well enough inside, so when this came out of the last process, it was in 2 pieces. But I thought it was worth putting back together if for no other reason than just use it as an example. Can you all see? That was kind of fun to do. Raku glazes are put on only in certain places. I guess you could glaze the whole thing. Yeah, I guess you could, because some of these beautiful ones are glazed all over. But in my case, most of mine have just a little glaze on. And then when it's put into the smoke, we get this nice charcoal color. Here's a little plate that has a little luster splashed on it, and that came close to getting lost because we have a crack developed here. This is the only piece I have of the pit fire. We'll look at that one again. This is another Raku piece. This is done with a slab method, and there were 4 pieces for the sides, and of course a piece for the bottom, and it was attached. This is a very old piece too, probably in the 70s. And it has a bottle inside, and it looks like a bottle inside. Then we can get more elaborate in our building if you want. This is done on the wheel. 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces, and put together and carved. Then the stages of the clay, we'll talk about those in a minute. The stages of the clay are moist. That means the way it is when I put it on the wheel, it's very soft. Okay. Up here. See, this is very soft. And the other word for wet clay is plastic. Leather hard is the one that I showed you over there. Bone dry is when it's ready to be fired. Greenware is an unfired piece, like this. And that's also called a bisque piece, which means it's not glazed. The bisque firing and glaze firing are mentioned here. And then the tools that I have written on your sheet are a bat. This is what we build on. I learned to throw on a wheel that was a stand-up wheel. And we didn't use bats. We threw directly on the wheel, and we had to take the pot off while it was wet if we were going to make another one. The bats are a real time saver because I can throw however many I have bats. I think I have about 20, so I usually throw 20 pieces at a time. But I stood against that thing like this, and I pumped with my foot like this and tried to center. You know, it's like worse than chewing gum and walk. It's very, very difficult. But that was how I learned. So the first potter's wheel I bought for KV was a stand-up. I never could get the kids to use it. They just thought that was too much of a challenge. So later we had electric ones. Fettling knife. This is a tool that we use in cutting bats or whatever. A pithing needle is something that we couldn't get along without. This is our needle. A rib, we have several kinds of ribs. This one is rubber. Kidney scraper, that's also a kidney scraper, by the way. Template, you know what a template is. It's a pattern which we use. And the potter's wheel. And the kiln could be electric or it could be gas, it could be wood fired. In my case, I have an electric one that I do the first firing in, and then I have a gas kiln that I do the last firing in. And it's called a downdraft kiln. That means that it has to, and then my glazes are what's called oxidation glazes. And this means that twice in the firing of 8 hours, I have to reduce the amount of oxygen that it's getting. It gets real complicated. And it has to be done on real precision. I have to go, after the first 4 hours, I have to go out and push that damper shut. And thank you. And the blaze comes out the peepholes and out the chimney, and it just looks real dangerous. And then after an hour, I go give it oxygen again. And then after another hour, I shut the oxygen off again. And this is what makes my glazes mature the way I want them to. Now, the methods of decorating pottery, we talked about the glaze. That's one way. And a glaze can be have several kinds of appearances. It can be matte or satin, glossy. It can be a stain, which would turn out to be just a real matte color. This piece has stain on the back of it. Also has a lot of texture made with an old potato bag, which is wonderful for texture. Lead glazes are what you might get on pottery if you buy them in Mexico, and those you have to avoid because it's very dangerous. But these are all lead-free. If they reach 2,600 degrees, they can't possibly have lead in them any longer. As I said, that one is a stain. An engobe, and you know I'd like to take a class on engobes and underglazes. I really need more information about those. I forget I'm on camera here. I better mind where I stand. Anyway, an engobe is a soft, slushy mixture of clay. Kind of has stain in it, different colorants in it. And those are often put on a piece of pottery at this stage, or even sometimes while it's still on the wheel. It might be at this stage. And those engobes stick on there beautifully. And then you would fire the first firing and then go back and put a glaze over. Or, as someone mentioned last week, I believe it might have been Bev, did you have salt glaze with you last week? Yes. I've never done salt glaze. But I do know that they put the engobes or the stains on, whatever they're going to use, and put it in the kiln at a certain temperature, and I'm not sure what it is, but I imagine pretty high. They have a peephole that they throw the salt in, and that creates an atmosphere that creates a glaze on it, very much sometimes like orange peel. That's the way it feels. But after they have used the kiln for salt glazing, you cannot go back to the regular method again because the atmosphere is already set in such a way that it would mess up a regular glaze, so you can't do that. Well, you know what opaque and transparent are. I don't have to explain that to you. Translucent is something that's kind of shiny and a little bit toward a luster, but not totally. An incised surface is what you just looked at in mine. It's cut into. This is actually pierced. This is clear through. Incising is just sort of cutting into the clay, and that one is pierced clear through. Slip trailing, that was another thing we talked about in Bev. She had a plate that had a raised surface on it, and that is done sometimes with a deer syringe. And it might be done while the piece is still on the wheel. You could dip into a thick slip and trail it and make some kind of a design, and that stays up. It's the right thickness. And it can be very beautiful because it gives it kind of a bas-relief effect, which is very, very nice. Wax resist. You'll notice that most of the bottoms of my pots have been waxed. Can't put my hands on them right now. But anyway, well, I guess this one has been too. You see there's no glaze at the bottom. And we can put wax on there to keep it from sticking on the shelf, but you can also put wax on a piece of pottery and then glaze over it, and the wax will resist glaze, and you will end up with the clay body showing through. I did a set of dishes for Marge and Dave Grove, and they wanted their logo, the big G with the horns, you know. And so I did these plates. Well, it might be fun to show you how I did those. And I waxed that so that the clay would, or so that the glaze would not stick there. Well, I hope I did a better job than that. It looks like it's flying away. But anyway, then I glazed it. I dipped in a color of brown. Then I dipped again over that into another color. So now I have brown and whatever color that was, and then I have that color by itself. And then I dipped this again in this, which was kind of a gray, and this was a cream color, and this was brown. So I got these nice gray, very, very earthy colors out of it. Sort of like the plate that's standing up down there. Except that the G and the horns were still visible as the color of the clay body. I made, I think, 18 so she could have 12 matching, but she took the whole bunch because she said she breaks one. I made the plates, and then I made goblets that were shaped like this. You see? Then I made the cup, a mug, shaped like the goblet, only it didn't have the stem. Didn't have a fat handle like that either. And then I made saucers that did not have the little place for your cup in it, so it could be used for a dessert dish if you wanted. And then I made a breakfast plate. And then I did her a lot of serving pieces, I think about 6 or 8 serving pieces. So she has enough to pass around to all of her children, I think, when she gets through with them. Press mold is a word that's here, and that's something that those of you who have worked in ceramics probably are familiar with, because many of the pieces that you get at a ceramist to clean up and glaze have been done in mold. But sometimes we have just a little thing that isn't that big that we press into the design. Like this could be called a press mold. If I pressed that in the clay, I would get a pattern of oak leaves, I guess it's maple leaves. Okay, and the methods of applying glazes, they can be sprayed, they can be brushed, they can be dipped, and as I told you in this case, I did a lot of dipping. And a lot of these have been poured. The plate again, let me get that plate. I just feel like I need to hold that and tell you. It's like talking with your hands, you gotta have something, you know. And this has been poured. I just hold it over a big bucket of glaze and pour. And then turned around and pour again. And it's kind of like happy accidents. You never know for sure what you're going to get. You have some control, but not total. But oftentimes, the spontaneity of that makes it even better than if I were controlling it. Yes, Beth?
What's the consistency of the glaze, or does it vary?
That's a real good question.
Technique you're going to use?
Yeah, it's about like cream. And the way I test mine, I learned this from one of my instructors. You take a dry finger and stick into it, and whatever sticks to your finger is what's going to stick on that plate. And if you get a lot on it, you know it's too thick, and you water it a little bit. Now, some are so technical that they even measure the amount of water to the amount of glaze. But I'm not that technical. If you really want to get technical about it, I did bring a book along that you could look at that'll tell you all about glaze components and everything, but 2 hours is not enough time, and I don't want to bore you with all of that. But that was a good question. And the thinner the glaze, of course, the more clay body will show through. But in pouring and dipping, usually one coat is all you need. And if you're working in greenware and cleaning up pottery, usually they tell you to do 3 coats. And in this, you don't have to do that. Of course, if you get 3 coats, that's all right. Sometimes it will get a little crackly, and all you have to do is rub it a little bit after it dries, and that'll sort of push it down, and it will melt very beautifully. Okay, the method of building a piece of pottery, the first thing I have to do is get it ready to work with, and that means I have to put it on my wedging table, which is covered with canvas, and I wedge it just like you need bread or biscuit dough or pie dough. Well, pie dough you don't need that much, but bread dough. And then after you do that, if I'm getting ready to work on the potter's wheel, then I wedge it on the wheel, and I'm going to demonstrate that pretty soon. But after the clay has been wedged, one of the most simple pieces that you can make, and almost all teachers will start at the very beginning, students with pinch pots. And there is one artist who does nothing but pinch pots. I think Bonnie has my book, and I've had it for about 5 years, so I imagine that's where it is. But anyway, he does everything pinch pots. He'll wrap rope around them, or he might put pine needles, or all kinds of things, and sometimes he pinches clear up his arm. I mean, this is all just done from the outside, and it'll be the shape of his arm, and then after he takes it off his arm, he'll structure it some way in an interesting shape. But, you know, you think a pinch pot, that's what you do in 4-H. No, it can be very beautiful and nicely decorated. And most of the tea bowls that were made by the Japanese and the Chinese and the people who did the Raku made pinch pots. In fact, we did that at our high school one time, and we had a little tea ceremony afterwards. I was so sorry that I didn't have an authentic Oriental there that could really take us through the beautiful traditional tea ceremony, because I think that must be very beautiful. This story I'll quickly share with you. I was at the water tower place one time, and I went into a Japanese restaurant there, and they served me tea in a styrofoam cup, and I said, "What are you doing? How awful to serve tea in a styrofoam cup with the traditions you have behind you." And he said, "Isn't it terrible? It just makes me sick." It was a fast food place, of course. It just didn't seem the right thing to do at all. And then a slab pot, as I explained, this is another method, and I can show you a real good way. I think if you're interested in doing hand building, slabs are kind of hard to get the same thickness. Now I have a slab roller, that's kind of cheating, but it sure is a time saver. And I can roll a slab 24 inches wide. Now when I did that drape, that huge piece there, I draped that over a rock, and that had to be wider than 24 inches, so I had to add on. I bet you wonder how I did that. That was tricky. That was tricky. I slid that slab off onto a board that had a piece of plastic on it, real thin, that comes from the dry cleaner. And I had already put things around this rock to support it. It's right, the rock is by my studio, and it's a very sharp rock, and if I just dropped it on there, obviously it would tear through. So I eased it off real carefully on there, and then when it got the right dryness, I made a base for it on the potter's wheel, and attached it, and then getting it off was even trickier. I had to build an armature, and I used blocks of wood, I believe it was, for that one, and had them on a board, and I lifted gently and got it over on there and left it until it dried. So that was very difficult. And I made probably 8 pieces in that series. I have a couple of them left, but I didn't see much sense in bringing more than one. And that would be called a slab drape pot. An inside press. Oh, I don't have one to show you. That would be where you would take a container of some kind, line it with damp strips of paper, and put your clay inside of that. It can be done in pieces, it can be in strips or whatever, and if it's inside a piece, you want to be sure that the opening at the top is wider than the bottom. Otherwise, obviously, you couldn't get it out, could you? Mm-hmm. I mean, I couldn't get it out of this if I wanted to. So it has to be something that has a rather open top, and that is called inside drape. Then we have what's called inside press, or inside press. Then we could also have what's, and I don't have that on this sheet, by the way, called pugging. And I'm sure you've seen some of the kids bring some of those pieces home. They make coils of clay, what the kids call snakes, and they roll out these coils. And you have a bowl that's a container, could be any shape that you want. I made a huge one for a flower pot once, inside of a big dishpan. And you have this damp paper in there, and you roll all these coils up and attach them to each other on the side, and then you put little balls in between these coils, so when you take it out of the container, it's solid on the outside. But it has all these neat shapes, beautiful designs on the outside. You can wander around with them, you know, wind them all around. It doesn't have to be just circles attached to circles. So it can be whatever your creative mind tells you to do. And the coils, I just mentioned, those long strips of clay. I had an instructor one time, he was a Cuban. He came to class every time in a 3-piece suit. Now, as you can imagine, and that was what was funny about it, the one I had before that never got out of big overalls. And so it was quite a contrast when Luciano came into class. And he was a coil maker. All the time he lectured us, he rolled coils, coils, long coils, short coils. And he piled these together, just kind of, it sounds like I'm saying like a pile of worms, but it didn't look like a pile of worms. It turned out to be a beautiful structure. And he has some coming up and some dropping over. Museum quality stuff, all made out of just simple coils about this size. Really neat stuff. He was the one that wanted us to make plates. There were 6 of us in the class that were painters. And he said, if you're all painters, I think you should make, each of you make 6 24-inch plates. Now think about how big a 24-inch plate is. And he said, then use that like a canvas. You're going to paint on this just like you would on a canvas. Well, he couldn't tell us how to do a plate, nor could he show us how to do a plate. I never once saw him work on the potter's wheel. He just could do coil. But anyway, every time we would go back into class, after it dried a little bit, we'd have 2 pieces. We have a picture frame here, and then we have a flat bottom. This will all crack and break away. And I'm going to demonstrate a plate for you after a while, and I'll explain to you what he didn't show us that I figured out for myself later in life. But he was an interesting character, and I gave him 20 of my wonderful slides that Lana had brought back from Ball State that her instructor had done, and I never got them back. I finally sent a registered letter, and I didn't get that back either, so I know that he knew I wanted them back, but I didn't get them. So I have something to say about Cuba. Scoring, when you're putting slabs together, scoring means that you scratch the surface to rough it up so that when you put 2 pieces together, they'll stick. But you also use slip, which is real runny clay in between. Sticky clay doesn't have to be real runny. And that will make the pieces stick together. And that's what scoring is. Throwing is the term used for when we work on the potter's wheel. And I had a hard time with high school kids. They thought throwing meant throwing. And we finally convinced them that you don't throw because it's too hard to require enough clay for a class. But they always thought that was funny anyway. Why would you call that throwing? And we aren't really sure whether it came from the centrifugal force throwing the clay out to the sides, or whether the very early potters who had a slave probably kicking the wheel to get the speed up would take a ball of clay and throw it on center thusly. I don't know. Doesn't matter. Anybody would call it throwing. Turning or trimming is what we do to a piece of pottery after it has been dried for a day, whatever it takes, depending upon the temperature. If it's real humid, it might take 2 days before you trim. Or if it's real dry, you might have to trim the same day that you make the piece. And this has already been trimmed or turned, as we call it. And that means it's been finished on the bottom so that it's ready for the next step. Okay, and throwing a pot. I'm going to demonstrate that, so I'm not going to tell you about that. How's our time? We got a half an hour by us already. I want to be sure and show you all the slides. The other sheets that we have here are talking about Raku and safety precautions if you're going to fire. Let me do a little drawing here for you. First of all, I was going to show you about a slab. Let me backtrack. I mentioned that I had the slab roller. Well, I got sidetracked there. What I want to tell you is, if you're going to do it, and you'd like to have slabs of certain thickness, this is a cross section of a board that you have nailed lattice on. You want to nail this the width that you want your slab to be. Say your rolling pin, whatever length your rolling pin is to roll this clay. Say that's the size of your rolling pin. You nail lattice on a board out here so that when you put the clay on there, you pushed it out pretty level, then you could roll it and the rolling pin rests on these lattice. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And if it's 1/4 of an inch, that's the thickness that your slab will be. I almost forgot to tell you that. So this is, from the top, it would look like this. Of course, you'd have the 2 lattice here. Then your rolling pin would go here. This way. Okay. On your handout, I have quite a bit of information about Raku. I think you'll enjoy reading that. And all you note takers are going to love me because you have to write all that down. Now my Raku kiln is a little different than this one. I haven't done any firing with mine for some time. It's pretty complicated and it takes at least 3 people to do it. That is at least with mine. And let me do a little illustration here for you. So first of all, this is about a 20-gallon barrel. an oil drum. Doesn't that look like an oil drum? It has a hole in the top, and it has a hole in the side, and it has a hole right here. Then you build with fire brick a base for that to sit on. And out here you have a flamethrower, like you burn weeds. So the hose and your tank is out here somewhere. And this has a control on it, so you can control your, what do I want to say, pressure? No, that isn't the right word. You guys know. Anyway, the amount of that it has. And this is going to throw the fire in here. Well, inside of this, we have something stacked up in there, like so. And we have two handles up here. And through those handles, we have a pipe. Piece of pipe. And you only put that on when you're ready to lift, take it off. Now this process, you can put this piece of pottery in there when this is really hot, and the pottery still isn't hot. But it has been bisque fired like this, and it has this little kiss of glaze on wherever you want to have your glaze. This is called a white crackle glaze, and I like that really well. Usually it crackles a little more than that. But then we have luster glazes too that are pretty. This is called Boy Scout luster, by the way. I'm sure you need to know that. But anyway, you put your luster glaze or whatever kind of glaze you're going to have on. And usually you can't fire more than a couple pieces at a time. This might be big enough for a couple. Might be one that size, maybe one over here that size. So you're going to put 3 in. So you got 2 people with gloves. They lift this thing up, and somebody over here very quickly with tongs take those pieces and set them in there, put the barrel down on, and this little peephole is a place where you can watch and see them, the glazes melt. And they melt very quickly, about 15 minutes. And this is what's so fun about Raku. You know within a half an hour what you have. With this, you don't know for at least 24 hours. It takes 8 hours to fire and 24 hours to cool the kiln down before you know what you have. But this is right away. So what you do, once you see those glazes melted on there, somebody's lifting these up, and over here you have another barrel with a lid, or a garbage can in my case. And it has anything from sheep manure and straw to grass to whatever that will create a smoke. And so somebody with a glove, while these guys are holding this up and somebody here is bringing them over, you take that off and they stick it in there and you put the lid on. It'll flame up and you let it flame just a little bit. Then you put the lid on, or you might put a few drops of oil in there even. The more smoke, the better. That's what gives you that nice black look. And wherever there's not any glaze, you will get black smokes like this. Then in about 15 minutes, when this next bunch is ready, you're ready to take these out of here, and over here you have a bucket that has water in it, or a tub or something. These are taken out, and they're still hot. So you take them out of there with tongs also, and put them in the water, and they just sizzle and crack, and of course occasionally they break, depending upon how well you put the piece together. And as I said, in this case, this did crack a little bit here. But usually, this is a wheel-thrown piece. It's usually the hand-built pieces that if you aren't really serious about getting them put together well, they will often, the bottom will fall out or you'll have bad experience. But you say, well, I did it once, so I can do it again. So you do it next time. So, does that sound like fun? It is. I had people come from a nursing home over in Kankakee, Illinois one time, and those folks in their wheelchairs stood around and watched us do this. And they just never forgot it. I've seen some of them since, and they had a great time. But it is a lot of work. And on your sheet, you will see that system. You'll also see the methods of building that I described to you. Yes, here we have the slab drape, slab construction, and the colorants and glazes. So I'm going to pass these out to you now. I have plenty. Why don't we start this way and just go right on through this one? Some more. Now, another kind, yes, question?
Doris, for those of us who don't know anything, what is pinch pot? You said that was like a beginner's wish.
Yes.
I don't even know what that
Well,
is.
you know what? That is so simple to do that I can quickly tell you. It's exactly what it says. You take a little ball of clay, like so, and you just begin pinching. And you pinch and pinch, keeping it smooth if you want to. You know, we talk about having nice even walls, and that's so important. One time at Valpo University, we had an instructor come out of Chicago, and he did a demonstration for us. And I said to him, gee, your walls are so uneven, isn't that going to blow up in the kiln? He said, probably. But he wanted to do something creative and not have it all real slick. But you just keep pinching until you have a little, you know what a pinch pot is, don't you? Yeah. And of course, you can do all kinds of designs and patterns on the outside. You can wait a couple of hours till it sets up and gets a little bit harder and then carve into it. Make a little coil around the bottom so it won't tip over. The slides that I got from my friend Doug Fay, I so regret that I forgot to bring one of his pieces that he gave me. He was great for Indian things. And he got so he would build 3 and 4 foot pots, great big tall ones like this. And he would fire them, and then he would break them and put them back together again, and they would look like they just came out of a museum. There's a little foot, that's called a foot. By the way, pottery is the same as people. It has feet, you see it has a foot, it has a belly, it has a shoulder, it has a neck, and it has a lip. You could also rephrase it as a rim instead of a lip. But one of the pots that I made one time, and Bonnie I think has that one also, I did just that. I made a foot, and the big toe comes up and is the handle for the cup. And I used a luster glaze on it. It's gold. And then there's a pair of lips for the top you drink out of the lip. And it has a navel for the belly. But that's a little pinch pot, nothing spectacular. And you would, of course, score that. Remember I used that word a while ago? You'd score this to get that to stick on the bottom. Be as elaborate as you feel. Be creative.
Doris?
Question?
I was just wondering about when you put things in more than one thing in a kiln, do you have to worry about like size, keeping them about the same?
Very good question. Whether it's Raku or any kiln, you certainly do if it's being glazed. If it's this piece, if it's a bisque fire, you don't have to worry about it. Sometimes I can stack plates, you know, rim against rim, and put in this foot, maybe 5 deep. So you can do that, you know, this way. But if there's glaze, and that's the reason we don't glaze the bottoms, because that would stick to the kiln shell. And usually people who do pottery, ceramics, they like the foot glazed. And so they will use what's called a stilt. That's another term that's not on there. And the word porcelain is not on your sheet. It should be right in that first section. That's another clay body. It's a white, high-fire clay body, if you want to write that in there. It's white, and it's like working with butter, but it's wonderful. And Scott Frankenberger, that you have a piece of his work, he's in Lafayette, and he works strictly with porcelain. Absolutely gorgeous pieces. Makes me look pretty bad. Anyway, what I started to tell you too, Doug Fay had made this beautiful bowl, and he was great into detail. And he did a lovely bowl, and then he did an Indian design inside with a sort of a red slip. And when we did the pit fire, that was one of his pieces that came out well, and he gave it to me. And I also had a piece of Jim Lorio's work, the other person that worked with us on the pit fire that I wanted to show you, and I don't know why I forgot them. I thought I had them in the truck yesterday, but I don't see them, so they must be home. Okay, I think probably I can show you the slides now. Do you want to take a break before we look at the slides? What do you think? How about you people in charge? Bob, what do you think? We should take a break, or should we look at the slides?
How long the slides going to go?
I didn't time myself. I could show you the first set, and then we can take a break.
Whatever works out best for
Okay,
you.
all right. I'm plugging that projector in over here so we can have total darkness. I worked that out for myself. I thought it was pretty clever. I thought for a while I was going to have to show slides with the light on. Oh, I know what I can do for a few minutes here. I didn't explain all these other great things to you. Golly. God. This is a piece of Raku. And that is from an assignment that I had to use a part of my anatomy. So I made a cast of my hands, and that's called the artist's hands. This one was a play on words, and I hope this doesn't offend anyone, but it's called a booby trap. And if you look, there are a lot of boobs trapped in there. Well, someone finds some humor in it. That was where we were to take a word. Another one that I did was called a wigwam. And I did a potbelly stove with a red wig on it, all coils, and it was a warm wig, you know, but I call it a wigwam. And he said, I'm glad you got that out of your system. I don't think that one got me an A, but this one did. Then another assignment that we had that was so fun, we had to do a transition. And we had to do something that was going to change the environment around you. And he gave us an example that you might build a 6-inch wall on your sidewalk. And so when the mailman came, he'd have to step over that. So it would be changing a process of some kind. And definitely it was the word process was used. So I had a 2-year-old granddaughter who would not be potty broken. She just absolutely refused. She'd say, Mom, would you change my pamper? But she would not go to the bathroom. So I decided if I would make her a throne, that maybe she would use it. So I made one out of clay. It had a little potty that slid in the back, and it was beautiful. It even had a lot of filigree on it that was gold, and it was quite a handsome piece. And so I took photographs of Mandy using this. The first photograph, she had a soggy diaper. And the second one, she was sitting on the throne. And it did look like a throne. I mean, it was real ornate. And then the third one, she had on little training pants or something. Anyway, there were 5 pictures. And I called it the process of elimination. that one was a real success. And believe it or not, she's going to be married. She's 26. She's going to be married at Christmas time. And I ran across those pictures the other day. And one, she's totally nude, and I can hardly wait to get those to her. I'm sure I'll wrap them with her wedding present. Anyway. Then another thing, and this is one that I did with my students. In the 60s, we had what was called pop art. And you would take a popular subject and paint it in some way, or do it in clay or whatever material you want to use. And this is a blueberry pie. And a student did this, and he said my mother wouldn't understand it, so he gave it to me. So I had this in my barn, and when I was cleaning the barn not too long ago, I dug it out, and I was happy that I did when I realized I could use it tonight. Another thing that we did, we were talking about this transition, a real clever thing that one of the other girls did, and I'll share that with you, much more clever than mine. She started with a loaf of bread. We could do 5 things in this process. She started with a loaf of bread, and this was brown crust, and this was white down here. And then she took a slice off of that bread, and she made it pretty tall, and it had less brown on it. And by the time she got to the end, she had made a wheat pot, something that was sort of shaped like a loaf of bread, but it was a beautiful pot, and there was just a little brown on the rim of that, and the rest was white. But there were five sections to it. The slice of bread just kept expanding and getting bigger and bigger. And one that I did, I didn't know I was going to talk about all this. I'm reminiscing like the Dickens, but I enjoyed doing it so much, and I'm glad to share it with you. I took a man's shirt and folded it like you'd get it from the cleaner, and I made a plaster cast of it, but I put a fountain pen in the pocket first. And my 5 shirts, the shirt gradually shrunk, and the fountain pen grew until I had a fountain pen that was this tall, and there was just the tail of the man's shirt coming out of it, and it was covered with one-halves. What I was saying was that a man's job often consumes him. that was I think that's packed away in a trunk somewhere. I'd forgotten all about that. Nice to be able to share that with you. Okay, these are some of my glazes. We're talking about glazing, and I didn't bring everything, but this is one that I use. And this glaze has been put on by splashing with a brush, and then a little oriental flip with the brush creates that. This has been poured and dipped and drizzled and not anything else that would put the glaze on.
Now, can you use that?
Yes, this is totally oven-proof and microwave-proof. This is kind of a nice little piece. It's a nice form. I think that's why I brought that along. It's shaped well. It's a little thick right here. If I were giving myself a grade, it'd probably be about a B-, but it's kind of a pretty little piece. And the lidded forms are made. I have a real slick way to get lids to fit, something that they didn't have years ago. And it's a caliper. Here it is. That, if I measure a lid that I'm making with this, let's say this is the lid, then I know the opening has to be this size. So if this is the lid, the opening is that size. Isn't that slick? It was $14. It saved me $1,000. These are a couple of other glazes, and I have a blue slip that goes under that creates that lovely blue, and that's the same blue as this, but it's a different outside glaze. And this is the one that I did over the rock. We talked about that. And this belongs to someone here at Carnegie. This was made, I believe, in David Harriet's class. And this is another step going a little further with clay, and it's sort of a sculptural bas relief. And this is a low-fire earthenware clay. And I fired it for them, so that's how I happen to have it. Any questions so far?
Doris,
Yes.
you mentioned your rock piece is stained.
Mm-hmm. On the outside.
On the outside.
Mhm.
When do you apply the stain at what stage?
After it's been bisque fired.
So after the
Uh-huh.
first fire.
And that stain is called iron oxide. What it is really rust, a liquid rust. And that's rubbed into all that textural area. And then when it's high fired, it comes out this really lovely color. I use a lot of that, and even for my candle lanterns that I make. I do candle lanterns with Oregon pines on them, just the trunks of the trees. I was inspired when I was in Oregon to do that, because when you're looking, all you see are trunks, you know, they're so tall. And then I cut out the negative space in between the trunks. And I usually just stain those. Then I do a lot of lighthouses and sailboats on some of them, all kinds of flowers. And I'll do something on that one after a while, maybe tulips or something. That was a good question. She's just filled with good questions.
You want to go ahead and take a break now, Doris? before we
Okay,
start the
yeah,
slide?
that'd be a good idea. I think I could use some water.
Okay, we'll take 10 minutes to
Some slides. These were done in the 70s. We happen to have a farm, and out at the back of the farm, we have this big sand hole that we used to call the blowhole because the sand would blow out of there. And that's where we dumped all of our trash and all of the limbs that might break off the trees when you have an ice storm or that kind of thing. So we had all this wonderful wood, and so I had Doug Fay for a professor at that time. And he said, oh, I wish we could find a place where we could do a pit fire, a real primitive fire. And I mentioned what we had. He said it sounded ideal. So the first time that we did this, a man from Art Institute by the name of Jim L'Oreal, who was a wonderful potter, and whose pot I forgot to bring with me tonight, he and his wife and Doug Fay and Susie came out and spent the weekend with us, and we did this pit firing. Well, we didn't know, there were lots of things that we didn't know would happen, but they didn't seem to mind if their pottery broke up. And some of these big pieces, these gorgeous things. And Doug would do round bottoms on his, like the Indians would do, with standing in sand, you know, they didn't have to have a foot on it. Oh, they'd be nicely decorated. And in fact, another thing I did for them in preparation of this, we had an old bathtub out in the orchard, and I put a lot of straw in there with salt water. And this is sort of like the salt glaze effect. And so when we got ready to fire, we dug a hole in the ground about 18 inches deep and about this big, and we put sticks, little sticks and things in there, and maybe a little of this salt straw, and put some pots and some more sticks. And I'm going to show you pictures. Finally, Doug's was as high as a teepee. I mean, this was a huge thing. And I never will forget, he lit his, and wind came up all at once, and it was all in flames, and it sounded like Arlo Redenbacher popcorn. Bing, bang, 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 bang. And all of his pots were cracking and breaking and blowing up, and he didn't seem to care. He didn't get very excited about it. And guess whose pots made it? Mine. These little things that were so insignificant, but after he lit his, we discovered that maybe, instead of lighting it all at once, we should build a fire out around it and let the heat kind of come in gradually. So you'll see slides of that. We did the fire out here, and then we let it come in gradually. But even Jim Lorio lost a lot of his pieces. But by the time we got to mine, we figured out another problem, and so most of mine survived. And there weren't any of them any more exciting than this. But anyway, after we did this firing, after it's done, and the pots are all heated through, you put sand over them and leave them overnight, and then you dig them up the next day, and it's just like Christmas. You don't know for sure what you have. But then the second time we did it, just Doug and Susan came that time, and we had an old piece of a furnace that had a chimney on it. It was a great big thing. And so this time we dug up a hill. It was up the hill, and it was like a grave. It looked like a grave, and there's a big circle up here, and that's where we put the pots. The sticks and the pots and the straw and the pots and the sticks until we had a good-sized pile. And then we started the fire at the bottom of this grave and kept working it up this way, and the chimney is drawing the heat up through it. And that time we saved almost every piece. But he did less significant pieces this time, and he also bisque fired first. And what did he say? Bisque. That's that first firing. And once he had done that, this made them a little more durable. They could stand the heat shock a little better than just the green clay would. So we learned as we went along too. We had an awful good time. We had a big watermelon, and then we covered them up. It was pitch dark when we covered the fire up. And here we all were sitting around in the total darkness, no flashlights, and a barbed wire fence between us and our vehicles. And we weren't sure how we were going to get out of there. And it was so quiet and so beautiful, we just sort of sat there for a long time. And some kid went by on a motorcycle, and I remember Doug cursing a little bit and thinking how horrible that anybody would interrupt our peace and quiet. But we finally made it back to the house. Okay, somebody is on the lights back there, I'll bet, huh?
Mm-hmm. Say when, Joyce?
Anytime. All right, these are slides that have been made from slides, so I have a little glare on this one. But you can see the milk tank is there with water in it in case we had a little problem with fire getting away from it. And there's a lot of wood across there. That's not a great slide. Here are some, whoops. I swear I never do this wrong. Okay. Apparently that was one that was supposed to be there. It wouldn't be there. That's some of the pottery that we're getting ready to fire that first time. And this is Jim Lorio's back, and you can see he has the pottery down in the ground. And here he has straw and sticks and things piled around it. And look in the distance at the upper left, you can see Doug Fay's pile of stuff over there. He's already got his ready for light. What a surprise. This is Lorio. And there's Doug walking away. He had the curliest head of hair. And I saw him 2 years ago. I went to my class reunion in Estes Park, Colorado. And he met me there, and he and his wife, and we had dinner. It was real nice to see him again. But those are pots piled up with that sticks around them like that. Here he's lighting it. The skinny little thing is his wife up there. There I am lighting mine. And here we go. Look at the smoke. Wow. And it's about this time that we were hearing the popping and cracking. Now it's burnt down and he's covering it. And he doesn't know for sure how many pieces made it. He doesn't know till the next day. This must be Lorio lighting his. These might not be in sequence, although I have them numbered this way. That's sort of a dishpan shape one. That's one of L'Oreal's that made it. It was a pretty good size piece. And here we are digging it up. That's Lana in the middle with the braids. A long time ago. This is the next morning when we're digging them up. It's sort of like an archaeological dig. You can see the black. Now, there were glazes on them, and if straw was against the glaze, oftentimes we had a real nice luster color. And sometimes, in fact, Jim L'Oreal's had a piece of roofing that melted against it, which enhanced it, strengthened that. Okay, now the next set was the second time we did it, where we had learned some things we were doing wrong. And here you can see the grave that's dug. And that's up a hill, although it doesn't really look like it here. Now you can tell that it's a little more uphill. And the bigger circle at the top, of course, is where we piled this grass and sticks and pots. And here you can see where he's piling his pots. I never will forget when he first came to Valpo University. He came a little earlier than this time of year, but he drove from Denver out of the mountains to Indiana, through Iowa and Illinois and Indiana, and he said he never saw so much corn in his life. He was raised in the mountains, so the flatland corn was quite an experience. So here's some nice shapes. These are his pieces. Now you can see the concept. See, the fire is down closer to you and the pots are up farther. Got wood piled all around them now. And another shot, and you can see the wood and the pots piled in the larger pile. And there's the old chimney we put. I don't have any idea where that thing came from, but it sure worked. It caused a nice draft, and it just pulled that heat right up into the pots. That's me. 20-some years ago. Oh my, I could bend my knees. Oh dear. Time goes fast. Okay, that's a good shot of it. And there was enough wood in there, we didn't have to keep stoking it. We just kept moving the fire up closer to it to warm it. Good shot of it. See how the smoke has drawn right up through that chimney? And this was the total brightness that we suddenly didn't have. When we covered that up, it was totally dark. And this is when it went down after the chimney was taken off. And then we covered it. Where it's covered with the sand. And it's sat in those hot coals and for overnight.
So how long is that flame burning?
It probably was at its peak for about 3 hours. Yeah, it burned pretty high and pretty hot for quite a while. And there's pot. Now, if you look to the right, just behind that first long piece, is the bowl that Doug gave me that I'm so sorry I didn't bring, because he had these beautiful Indian designs inside, and that was the only color on it, and the rest of the piece is sort of a gray color from the smoke. That was a slip or an envelope that he had painted on there. Very delicate pattern. Some of my pieces are in through there too, luckily. It's been so long now. Okay. Now, the next group of slides I'm going to show you are the ones that Doug sent me. And these are funky art. They're really different. And most of them are Raku. I don't believe that is. That just looks like a little fire, kind of a sculpture thing. And I wish he had sent titles. I think that would help so much. I suspect that he used an extruder. If you don't know what that is, that's a machine that will push your clay shapes out for you like a cake decorator. I suspect that that's hollow and it's an extruded circular piece.
Now, where is he now?
He works for the university in Boulder, Colorado, and his job is to set up all their shows that travel. And he was down in southern Wyoming when I talked to his wife the first night a couple weeks ago, and they were fighting the fire to see that it didn't get into the museum where he was putting the show up. The building did get warm, actually. They were quite concerned. Now, this is Raku, and I'm not sure, it looks like it might be bone that he has stuck through there. And probably he left a place for that, and that was put on afterward. But you can see a little crackle glaze over the top part of those circles over the top. And this is a plate with some decorative things on them. Those slides that I let Luciano have were done by Linda Arndt, I believe that's her name, who still teaches at Ball State. And she does all these little marine creatures on all of her pieces. There'll be little snails or little shells and things. Very beautifully done. And she works almost entirely in porcelain. I hope you all remember to write porcelain on your sheet that I gave you as another clay body. Another plate. That has crackle glaze on it. You see the cracks? What is so nice about that, when that glaze gets a certain temperature, it shrinks away from itself and it creates all these cracks. Well, then when you put that into a smoking environment, that will enhance them, just like if you crack eggs and put them in beet juice, and what happens? Or if you make tea eggs with tea and teriyaki sauce, that's the same kind of principle. That has a little fur on it, and I believe those are porcupine quills. That's not something you're going to put potatoes and gravy on. This is kind of an interesting piece. Again, the orange at the bottom is probably not the clay body. I would think that's fire flashing. It's created the orange color. Strange. This is clay art. That's what we're talking about tonight. Now these are little boxes. Kind of nice, I think. These are wheel thrown pieces and extruded handles with crackle glaze. A little more fur on that. He's the one that gave us all those crazy assignments. I tell you, he was a shot in the arm to everybody at Alpha University. Those Lutherans were so somber and quiet and all that stuff. They invaded the place and it was never the same. Kind of neat. Another Raku piece. Now you see those little sort of oriental calligraphy on there. I suspect that was a slip that he painted on with his oriental brush, and then in the Raku process it took on a different color. See all that. It's like a little deed at the top. I'm not sure what that says. I'll have to get him on the phone and let him explain all this. How about that? That has a bird on it. And that's white crackle at the bottom, which is similar to my pieces. I remember one of the things that he had, one of the students did as a transition. She did a shirt out of clay, and it had birds all over it, like parrots, like it would be a Hawaiian shirt. And each transition to the next step, there were fewer birds. And the last one, there was a bird sitting on the shoulder of the shirt, but not on the shirt. It was so clever. I just never forget that. I had my students do that. I kind of borrowed that idea from him, and I remember one did a ladybug that turned into a Volkswagen. A bird. That looks like something Bonnie might have done with the straw and the rattan. Raku again. Those are different. As I said, I wish I had titles to these. Now that has to be a crab claw, isn't it? Is that what you see, crab claw?
Doris, I have one question. Would that be a real clam
I'm
claw
wondering.
in there?
I think so.
Or would your birds be out of the clay, or would
Oh.
they be?
You mean the ones we just saw?
Yes.
I suspect that they probably were on clay, but this looks like it could be actually the claw. Here's another claw. Well, that one's busy. As I said at the beginning, what might be art to one might not necessarily be to someone else. So who can determine whether clay is art or clay as art is legitimate or not?
When another material is added, like the feathers or the
Yeah.
flower, how is it?
How's it put on?
Uh-huh.
I would suspect it's glued on. In this case, it's added with twine around it. And then has feathers painted on. That's interesting. There's another Raku. And I don't know what the white thing is. I suppose that's something that's been added after. It definitely hasn't been in the smoke. It's in the reduction part of it. Let's see. Well, that's a nice Raku glaze on the top part of the pot itself, on the shoulder. And some nice patterns that have been achieved on the sides, the belly and down the side of the piece. And then he's got a drip up there, look at that.
Yes.
Another added interest. He got so he was working almost entirely in low fire red clay, and he would just use clear glazes over that. And he was selling that stuff, doing really well. But now he works for the university. Okay, we can have the lights and all. I think our time is just going beautifully. It'll give me about a half an hour to demonstrate on pottery. I'll take some questions though first if you have them.
I've got a couple of questions about that pit firing, Doris.
Yeah.
Not the least of this, why would you ever do it? But, is that something that was used, say, before there were kilns?
Oh, yeah.
Is that the way pottery was made?
It's
before?
primitive firing is what it is.
So the Native American Indians maybe
Yeah,
used
they
that?
probably did.
What about the temperatures that you reach and?
We had no way of measuring the temperature. We didn't have a.
But can you tell from what comes out?
Yeah, you can tell because.
Is
you
it
can
hotter
also-
or is it cooler than what you get out of your kiln? I would think it's
I would think it's about like my bisque, maybe 1900 or so, because we used a low fire envelope on the pieces so that they wouldn't mature, and nothing is high fired sound and listen. Hear that? As opposed to this even. You can tell that that's higher fire. Of course, this has a crack in it, which would make it sound a little different too. But these are. It's a low ring, so it's a low fire. Yes?
Does the firing temperature affect the durability of the pot, or is it the type of clay
I
you
think
determines the temperature.
any really low-fired piece, unless it's totally glazed, is not going to be watertight. Your glaze is what will make it watertight if it's a low fire. And if it's a high fire, if I didn't glaze this piece and I planted in it, the plant would breathe, but eventually this would get damp. But it does make good flower pots. The only thing, if I make a flower pot on the wheel that has the dish attached, then I always dip the dish in glaze, so that, and then I fire it upside down. So the dish itself is glazed on bottom too, and that keeps your tater from getting there.
Well, is that the same process as terracotta? I mean, a terracotta pot that you would put a plant in, or,
Yeah?
I mean, that breeds too.
Yes.
Is that just a different?
But you
kind
put something under it, you don't set it on a good
Yeah,
table
right.
without having something to protect it from the
But
moisture.
I mean, as far as it being a course.
Yeah, it's quartz. And these pieces were definitely quartz.
What about breakability? Does the fire?
Well, the hot fire makes them a little more durable. They aren't as afraid. Of course, anything, you know, here in China, if you drop it, it would probably break. I'm not going to drop this to test it, but probably on carbon it would bounce and might not break. I just incorporated a little red glaze into my last few pieces, and I'm finding that it doesn't come out real red for me. You can see a little red here. There's a potter over at Francisville that shared some red with me, and he said, try it and see if you like it. Now on this, the red came out a mauve color, and I think it's because I'm firing at a higher temperature, and so I know when I was teaching high school and we would use red, sometimes they would come out gray. The red would fire out if I got it a little too high. One of the things I didn't mention to you was how we measure the temperature in a kiln. An automatic shut-off kiln, if it has an automatic shut-off, it has a little, what is called a pyrometric cone that goes into the mechanism, so that when it reaches the temperature that cone will melt, it curves and then the trigger drops down and shuts it off. A pyrometric cone is shaped like this, and I guess that's why it's called a cone. And strangely enough, when you're measuring temperature, I'll show you. We have, the low temperatures are down here. So we have an 01, 02, 03, and the numbers keep getting bigger. The numbers keep getting bigger, but the temperature keeps getting lower. So this is the temperature that I fire, my first firing, about 1920 degrees. Now, as we go up this way, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, and the higher the number gets, the higher the temperature gets. And this is where I take this one to cone 9, and that's how you say it, cone 9, and I put 3 cones in what's called a cone cookie. And these cones are put in there, shaped like this. Oops, that's not a very good drawing. And they're slightly leaning, just a little bit. This is the one that melts first, and I put these in my kiln behind a peephole where I can see those in there. And I have a plug that plugs that in, and when this one, which is cone 8, when that melts, I know we're beginning to feel some heat. That will go over, like so. Cone 9, it goes over, and some glazes are done. They're vitrified, or they're matured at cone 9. Some of them have to go to cone 10. So when I see that one starting over, I know it's time to put it on what we call soak. And for a half an hour, I turn it down very, very low. And they tell me, although I don't know that this is a fact, that that's the time that the glazes have been bubbling on the sides of the pots. And when you put it on soak, it grabs right onto the pot. And if I didn't soak, I would have little air bubbles in there. So I take the word for it. So that's the end of the process then. I can shut it off. And sometimes that's 2 o'clock in the morning.
Doris, what does a soak mean?
Well, it's just that the heat is penetrating, it's just soaking into it, just what it says.
It's the heat.
So what are those little cones made of?
And the little cones are made out of a material that will melt at exactly that temperature. They look very much like clay. In fact, they probably are. And when that one reaches that temperature, that cone will go over.
And that's about 2,500.
For these glazes, yeah, it's a high fire glaze. Now, I would guess that probably these Raku glazes, maybe they are melting at about down here to an 017. I know lusters will melt at 017. So
What
that's
about
a,
porcelain? Where's that?
porcelain is a high-fired clay, so whatever glaze you put on it, you fire it to fit it. And usually it's a high fire. The glaze should fit the clay, and although I have put low-fire glazes on high-fire clay, but you can't reverse that. See, I could not put, in fact, the first year I had my own kiln, I took some of my clay down to KV and ran it through the pug mill, because it was kind of old clay. I ran it through the pug mill, not thinking that inside of this thing was some low-fire clay that we had used in the high school. So the very first time I used this $4,000 gas kiln, the pots melted and fell against the wall of my kiln. I said, I'll never make another pot in my life. I was just sick, absolutely sick, until I figured out what was wrong. I had too much low-fire clay in there that I had brought to too high of a temperature, and it melted. So the next time I used only high-fire clay at that temperature, it was fine. Now, any questions? Any more? Good questions. Good questions. All right, well, I'll tell you what I think you want to do is get your chairs up closer. And the first thing I'll do is show you what we're going to do with this. And we can probably do that here before you move your chairs. What kind of image do you think that needs? Anybody have an idea?
You're asking us.
It's kind of round. It's kind of round and bulbous, so maybe we'll do a daisy or something. So I would just start writing and draw a center on this daisy, and do some petals. Bringing some clear up to the top. Remembering the daisies are not always face on, you know, the lips turn sideways. And we'll do some little marks in them. We have the prettiest sunflowers this year. My daughter sent me some from Texas that are pink and yellow and burgundy. This is called incising, cutting into the clay. Then we could do one here. I'm not going to cut this whole thing because we're going to get to throw to do that.
How long can it, you leave that before you cut it?
Well, it needs to be just about this hardness, which is called leather hard. And so I control that with plastic bags. I put them over them individually, or sometimes I'll lay a whole table full of plastic over them. And when they get the right temperature or the right dryness, then I'm ready to carve them. And sometimes I've left them up to a week. But to do that, I have to cover them very tightly, and I put wet sponges here and there inside, like if I've done an art fair or something where I have to work a couple of days and can't trim the second day, then I would control it that way. What we have to do is design this in such a way that we don't have huge openings or it will fall apart. Those are leaves. We could have a stem. And none of mine are ever too alike because, and Marcia knows that, she's going to have 30 owls one of these days, little owl candle lanterns, but although I'm going to use a pattern, they'll all be a little different. Then with an X-Acto knife, I cut in on the outside of those little drawings. And this is very easily handled at this point. I started cutting holes out. And I cut the negative space. Someone said, did you ever do the positive space? And I have. I did a tulip one time where I cut the tulips out instead of the space between them, and I didn't like it. I used the hammer on it. sure I've had other pieces that deserve that too.
So can you use that when
Yes.
you break them up?
Oh, when it's broken up? No, you just put that out in the trash. See, that's, no. Now, this is beginning to get kind of dry, and I didn't bring any plastic with me. I wonder if we have a plastic bag in the back room. Anybody want to take a minute and look for me, and I'll slip in one because I don't want it to get any drier. And one of the most popular ones that I do is of lighthouses and sailboats, and they sell like as fast as I can make them up in New Buffalo, Michigan in the gallery. People love them up there. And sometimes I stain them and sometimes I glaze them like this blue light. Now this could be, say, 3 flowers and not do anything back here. It could have a front, or it can go all the way around and not have a front, whatever I would choose to do. Once I get started, I hate to quit, but I will go in just a second. I'm going to cut this piece out. And I've done birds, and I don't get bored because I change images every so often. So that's it.
Use this door.
That'd be great. Now, Bob, what do you suggest? I'm here, maybe we can scoot the tables back a little and you people can bring your chairs all up. I promise I won't throw clay on you. If they have on white pants, you can sit in front, that's fine. So you can get close enough to see.
Want to stop it for a minute and just put it over in there? Huh?
Right back here.
There we go. Turn it off.
Don't you know this is one of the old extensions? Turn it around. Maybe one side.
It's a ground.
There you go.
It's got 3 pieces. Won't work.
That's an old extension cord.
Got another extension cord.
Yeah, probably.
See, this is an old cord that doesn't have.
You may not need an adapter. That may look good.
Okay, this is. And this is what makes it possible for me to get a piece of pottery off. However, I could lift it, and I may show off and show you how to do that too. This clay has all been wedged on my wedging table. My wedging table is a plaster table. It has a trough in it with about that much thickness that's filled with plaster. And then it has canvas over the top of that. So when I wedge, if the clay is real wet, that absorbs a little of the moisture. And if it's not very wet, I hurry and get it off before it does absorb. So I wedged about 20 times and get this in pretty good shape, so that it doesn't have any air bubbles in it, hopefully. And the next step is sticking it on the wheel. And I think your handout might tell you the various steps. That's the first thing.
Is all your clay that brown color, Doris, or is it?
You know, this is called 259. I get a battleground from Scott Franklin from Indiana Clay, and this is the color mine always is. But if you get something that has a little iron flecks in it, it'll be a little more red than this. And then some of it is more of a buff color when it's fired. Mine looks kind of pink when it's first fired. But then after it's fired the second time, you see it, pick up the blue picture. Yeah, see the bottom of that? That's the grayness that it.
So that turns into that color?
Yes. Now, I kind of like the little iron speckles, especially they will come creeping through the glaze, but I'm not sure what number I'd have to have, and I can depend on this so that I haven't let it change.
Can you use that gumbo clay?
You know, we talked about that. Someone said they had dug up some real good blue clay. But I started to tell you a while ago that a clay body is made up of several kinds of clay, and each clay is added to that recipe for a reason. If you want it high fire, if you want it to melt at certain temperature, whatever you want. And if I used blue clay out of Rensselaer, I'm sure it would need something else with that. Because I tried some when we dug our pond, and it just melted in the kiln. Even
How
though
about that in Hobart? They used to make breakout.
I don't know. Now, there's another thing mentioned on there is fire clay in Glazes. I don't know if that's in that, on that sheet. But anyway, that's what bricks are made out of, and they're sort of red. Well, not all bricks are red anymore. They used to be. So I would think I could use that too. Okay, what I need is a lot of speed at this point, so I have an accelerator over here on the right side. My first wheel that I purchased for myself was both manual and electric, but it was a great big thing, and I was invited to do a lot of school artist in residence things, and I couldn't get that out of my studio, so I went to the smaller one and sold that one. So I need a lot of speed at this point. And what I'm going to do is force this clay on center. And to do this, I do what's called wedging it on the wheel. And this is bringing it up and down 3 or 4 times. And each time I do, it will get a little bit closer to the center. I bring it up and then I force it back down. And I have a bucket over here on the side that all my scraps go in. And when that bucket gets filled, if it's real juicy and wet, I will put it out on a plaster bat that's about this thick. And then I put one on top of it. It looks like a big chocolate ice cream sandwich. And in about 3 hours, the moisture will be drawn out of the clay into the plaster, and then I can take it off and wedge it and use it again right away. But it depends on how moist it is. And if it's all trimmings, then sometimes I have to add water.
Doesn't that clay bother your hands, make your hands
No,
all
it
dry?
isn't. It isn't the clay, it's the washing, and each time I take a piece off, I go to my sink and wash my hands. So what I do is wash all the oil out of my hands. And that's what's hard on them. What I'm going to make for you are 2 things. I'm going to make, it is two things, is or are, whatever. Anyway, I'll make a tall piece and I'll make a flat piece. So you see how I'll make the clay. Now, if my hand doesn't jiggle on there, it's pretty nearly centered. My bats are a little bit warped. I had the misconception that each year I should clean these bats all off and wash them real well. So when I would quit for my Christmas opening, I would do that. And invariably, when I'd start throwing the next season, my bats would be warped. And I couldn't figure out why. Well, that was why. So this year, I didn't wash them. That's why they look so dirty. I just decided I'd store them with it on there. So they are, some of them still a little bit warped. Okay, that's about ready to open up. And kids are so fascinated by this because you take a solid piece of clay and you make it into an open vessel. And to open that up, I use my 2 thumbs. And notice I use my arms against my body a great deal. And my body helps to support my hands. And I go down clear to where I want the bottom of that pot to appear. And if I'm not sure where it is, then I use my needle, which is in here. I take the needle and I stop it and I measure. I want it to be about 1/4 of an inch. That's a little thick yet, so I can go down just a little bit farther. And then the next step, and when I was first learning, I thought, wow, I've got that open, I'm ready to bring it to size. Well, then I ended up with an inside that looked like that. What we want is an inside that's square. So to do that, I use these 2 fingers, and I bring this right over. And now I have formed a bottom in there, and I have this sort of a donut or tire shape out here. And that's what's going to make the wall of this piece. And I learned to throw with a sponge in my right hand, and so we take the sponge. The speed is less at this point. And I'm pushing out with this inside finger, and I'm following it up with this finger. And if you notice the profile of the pot, there is a ridge. And that ridge is being made by that inside finger, and the outside one is following the ridge up. Everything that I make, except a plate or a bowl, now listen to this, take notes, I don't think that says it on your paper. Everything I make, except a plate or a bowl, is a cylinder first. I make a cylinder and then I make it into a shape or a form. What I'm doing now is evening out the bottom, smoothing it out, so that if I do make it into a candle lantern, the photograph won't tip over. Now I keep bringing this up until I get the thinness that I want. Obviously, the more clay I have, the larger piece I can make. And when I was younger and stronger, I could take 15 pounds of clay and make a huge salad bowl. And I sold all of them before I knew I was going to have 13 grandchildren that I could give them to. Now I'm too weak and old to do it. So I'm making little pieces. Okay, we're going to bring it up again. Notice it's still a cylinder. still against my body whenever possible. Of course, when you get a piece 15 inches high, then you have to get this left arm away sometimes. I'm going to use this tool and cut away a little bit here so that I can get under it with my right finger. Some of this stuff is used for decorations. You see that farmer's pot down there. You want to pick the one way down there up? See all the stuff on the side of it? That's the stuff I cut off when I attach it. It's the original. I will bring it up one more time before we make a shape out of it. Now you notice my left arm is up and away from my body. And it takes a little practice and steady nerves. Some people throw a lot thinner than I do, and that's quite an art. But I kind of like stoneware to have a little weight to it, so I don't worry about making it paper thin. Okay, now I'm ready to give this a little bit of shape. Let me go on here again. See, that makes it possible to get this finger up there when I want to bring it up.
Why the sponge door? Just for
It keeps it moist on the outside, for one thing. Okay, now I'm going to push a little harder with the inside hand and support it with the outside finger. So this is giving it some shape. And when I get it up where I want the shoulder to be, then I will relax with the left hand and let the right hand do the work. Then this is where the art comes in. You know, anybody can learn to make a piece of pottery if you're patient enough. Then you have to look at this piece and say, well, what does it say? Does it say I'm wimpy, or is it I'm the same height as I'm wide that you go? Does it look like it wants to be a rim, or doesn't it want to be a rim? So we'll say, I want to be a rim. And so if we do, then we make it a rim. Put it down, and it actually becomes a rim.
How did you do that? Is there pressure with your right
Yeah,
hand then?
pressure with the right hand on the neck of it, and pressure on the left hand on the lip organ. Then you can see that the bottom is almost the same width as up here, and if you look inside, you can see that I have something to play with out here. I can cut it down, and look how much nicer it's going to look when I come down here and take some of this off. I remember saying to Doug Fay one time, Doug, how do you know how deep to trim? And he says, well, when you see daylight, you back off. So, well, if I see daylight, I know I've gone too far. But you look at that and see how much more graceful it is with that cut away from the bottom. It gives it a lift, like it's not growing out of the wheel. And we can do something with decorations up here. This is kind of a slick little trick. If I just move this tool up and down here a few times, then it'll give us a little design. Really nothing to it. Sometimes I do this on a bowl. I'll have a rim on the bowl, and then I cut that out, and it makes it filigree or kind of lacy. Oh, no, that'd come off tomorrow.
And what did you say those slats were?
They're called bats.
And they're out of fiber.
Yeah, sometimes they're made out of, even out of masonite, just a quarter-inch ones. But they do have a tendency to work a little bit. See, this is what dries the hands up. And then mixing my glazes will also dry my hands, because I use a lot of chemicals. And I've only recently decided that I'm going to start wearing a mask. I had a friend die not too long ago from mixing glazes. He's breathing too many chemicals. Of course, he's a production potter and does it every day, where I do it seasonally, so it's not quite as serious. But I'm not ready to die yet. There's some things I want to do. Okay, now we're going to make a plate. You see how I do it.
Can you transport that home tonight?
Yeah, I didn't think that. Relax. No. friends. These have traveled and they're kind of stuck together. I'm not going to keep you all night and throw all of that. Do one more. This is probably about 3.5 pounds of clay. And there was a time in my life when I could wedge and center 15 pounds. And now I can do probably 5. So, steering on the corner. Of course, I had my right shoulder out of place 3 times in 2 years. I bad for a powder. Making pottery didn't do it, that's what I was going to ask. Opening garage door, getting a cat out of a tree, hanging a painting. Okay, here we go. All the speed we can get. I use my body as much as I can and support my arms. This is one of the tricks that I learned from my father. I was in charge of getting all the art teachers together in northwestern Indiana when I was teaching some years ago. In fact, it was the year that Atlanta was Miss Jasper County, so it must have been a long time ago. And the reason I brought that up is because this young man came from South Bend to be our demonstrator. That was before I could work on the wheel very well. And he spent the weekend with us, and Lana went to stay all night with a friend, so I put him in her room, and he said he could hardly wait to get back home and tell his wife he slept in the bedroom with Miss Jasper County. Very sense of humor, obviously. Bedroom with Miss Jasper County.
Doris, why are some pieces of pottery much lighter in weight than others?
Thinner walls,
Just
and sometimes clay body too. Porcelain is what it is. Have you ever visited his studio?
Frankenberg?
He's just got a hole in the wall in the basement, hardly any room. And he just makes these gorgeous pieces. He has several galleries and museums that sell his work.
It's also changed his colors. You know, it always made that red color.
I have a little red box.
Mine doesn't now.
Okay, since we're going to make a plate, we are going to obviously have to get the thing flat. So rather than opening it up and bringing it up like we did the other one, we flatten it with the waist. I'm going to slow this down. I'm going to get right down on it. Some more pressure. Also get serious. So now it's opened up, just like the other one was, down to where I want the bottom to be. And now I'm going to drag this across the wheel, and as I do, I'm forcing it down on the wheel as well. Now you'll all want to go out and get yourself a wheel tomorrow. It is a lot of fun. And my recommendation to anyone that calls me and says, would you give me lessons? Is you go to the university like I did and take classes as a special student. They'll provide you with the firing facilities, all the clay you need, and the time to throw. And if you like it, then you can invest $5,000 and get into it. But I can't afford to teach and wear out my kiln, and they'd have to practice. You need a wheel that you can practice on all the time. I wouldn't want somebody in my studio every day.
You must spend a lot of time in it yourself.
Yeah, I'm there pretty much. You know what I'm working on now? I'm so excited about it. I told Bob last night. I'm doing a painting for the celebration of the courthouse. And it's a painting within a painting. It's acrylic. And I'm doing a painting of my studio with my table, with all my supplies on it, and my easel with a painting of the courthouse on it. I struggled with it. Now, I told you I was going to tell you what Luciano didn't explain to us. We tried everything we could to get a plate to paint on. We flattened the clay out, we brought the sides up, we did everything we could think of. But each time we would go into the drying room, we'd have have a bottom and we have sides separated at this point. Well, I've determined since that we were weakening that, either with a tool or by laying it down and bringing it up. So I saved this clay out here, and that's what I make my side out of. I want to use a rib. That's over there too. Yeah. And this is what I compress this with. And this makes it nice and firm. Also gives me a nice shape over here to play with. And now I'm going to bring the sides of this up, just like I did that other piece of pottery. Now we have something we could serve the pasta in, or you can make a nice blackberry cobbler in it, or whatever. So what we have is either a shallow bowl or a deep plate, whichever you want to call it. But we're going to make it into a plate with a rim, so. Ooh, it's beautiful decorations. You know, if we want to do it done Fay, we put those in there. Or, Bev, this would be the time we'd take the syringe and do our slip tray. Okay, heads up, everybody, now we're going to make it into a plate. You have to take the inside, so we take the outside. And now you all get to clean up for me. Any questions?
How are you going to take that off of there?
I'll leave it on the bat tonight. However, I have taken them off. If I've had to, I can do it. And it's a neat thing to take them off and make a platter out of them. You pick them up and drag it across the surface and then stretch them along. But it's pretty hard to keep from distorting it at this
So you let it dry, and then it comes off easier, is that it?
Yeah, in the morning I would take it off, I'd cut it loose, which is what we have to do. I bet I didn't cut that one loose for you, did I? Have to cut it loose, that's what this is for. And I might want to take this off. See, I don't splash batter, but I do get it on my front. And then I have this wire real taut, and drag it like so right underneath the plate. Now it's cut loose now. And then tomorrow it will be possible to lift it off, and I put it on a board with some papers underneath, strips of paper, because as it dries, it will begin to shrink. We have shrinkage in the drying, we have shrinkage in the bisque, and we have shrinkage in the high fire. So if one wants to make a certain size piece, you have to know what your shrinkage is. In fact, I made a ruler, a 12-inch ruler, and it's only 11 inches long. But when I'm making a piece, I can gauge the distance, the size that will make. I just do that. You didn't put this off. I'll do that. Anyway, when I put this on the paper, it makes it possible for the pot to shrink and the papers are overlapping and moving. Where if I put it on, say this for instance, and left it, as it began to dry, it would stick to this, and then you would have a big crack right down the middle of it. So it has to be on something that makes it possible for it to shrink. Any questions? Questions? That's it.
Thank you, George.